Get comfortable. Let the day you have been carrying slide off your shoulders. Let your breathing slow and lengthen, and let the world shrink down to just this quiet voice and the soft dark around you. Tonight we are going somewhere very particular, and we are going to stay there a long, unhurried while, moving slowly through the hours, which is exactly what you want when you are trying to fall asleep. We are going down into the belly of a great house, into a stone-floored room lit by a single flame, in the coldest and darkest part of the night, when nearly everyone in the world above is still fast asleep. We are going into a Victorian kitchen before dawn. Here is where we are going, and who you are going to be. The year is 1885. The place is a large and comfortable house in England, the home of a wealthy family, the kind of house with many rooms and many servants, and a family upstairs who never once in all their lives light their own fire or fill their own kettle, and you are not the family. Tonight you are the very lowest of all the people who serve them. You are the scullery maid, the youngest and the least regarded person in the entire household, and you are about to wake in the cold and the dark, hours before anyone else, because the whole vast machine of the house cannot begin to move until you have lit the fire that makes everything else possible. Now, you may have a picture of a Victorian kitchen already, and it is worth setting it down before we begin, because it is a warm and cozy picture, and the reality was something rather different. You are perhaps imagining a snug, glowing room, copper pans gleaming on the walls, a great fire crackling, good smells rising, a plump cook stirring something at the stove while the rain falls softly outside. And that warm and glowing kitchen did exist later in the day when the fire was roaring and the cooking was in full swing. But it did not exist yet. Not at this hour. At this hour the kitchen is cold, stone cold, the fire dead in the grate, the room black except for the small light you carry, the copper pans dull in the dark, the whole space silent and chill and waiting. The cozy kitchen of the picture is a thing that has to be made every single morning out of a cold, dead room by human hands in the dark, and the hands that make it are yours. And here is the thing to hold on to, the thing that reframes everything we are about to see tonight. The entire comfortable life of the family upstairs, their warm rooms, their hot water, their breakfast appearing as if by magic on the sideboard. Every bit of it began here, in this cold kitchen, with the lowest servant in the house rising in the dark to light a fire. The whole enormous edifice of Victorian comfort, all its ease and plenty and grace, rested at its very foundation on this, on a young girl waking before dawn in an unheated attic, and coming down to kneel at a cold grate. The family would never see it. They would never think of it. They would wake hours from now to a warm and functioning house, and imagine, if they imagined anything at all, that it had simply always been so. But it was not so. It was made so, nightly, by you, and by the labor of the people down here in the dark. And tonight we are going to witness that making, from the first cold moment of waking to the hour when the kitchen is warm and bright, and the family's breakfast goes up the stairs. Think of it, before we go down, as a kind of secret that hid in plain sight in every great house of the age. Upstairs, comfort, warmth, plenty, appearing as if of its own accord. Downstairs and out of sight, the human engine that produced it. running before dawn and long past dark. The two were the same house, joined by back stairs and hidden passages. And yet they were two worlds, and almost no one who lived in the upper one ever troubled to visit the lower, or thought about the hands that fed the fires and heated the water and washed the endless dishes. Tonight, we are going to live in the lower world, the hidden one, the one that made the whole thing possible. And by the end, you will never look at the cozy warmth of a great old house in quite the same way again, because you will know what it cost, and who paid it, and how early in the cold, dark morning the paying began. So before we begin, if you would like more nights like this one, quiet journeys into vanished worlds, you might subscribe, and you might leave a comment telling me where you are listening from tonight, and what hour it is where you are, because I am always struck by the thought of this voice going out into so many different darknesses at once, and there is nothing you need to hold on to or remember as we go. Let it all wash over you. If your attention drifts, let it drift. If you fall asleep before the fire is even lit, which is entirely the point, the kitchen will go on waking whether you follow or not. So let go, and let the words carry you down, into the dark, into the cold stone kitchen, and the very first moment of the day. It is somewhere around 5 o'clock in the morning, though you do not know the exact time, because there is no clock in your room, and the whole world is black. What wakes you is not light, for there is none, and not sound, for the house is silent. What wakes you is habit and dread, the body's own hard-trained knowledge that it is time, that it must be time, that to lie here a moment longer is to risk the whole morning falling behind, and the cook's anger falling on you. You wake in the cold, in the dark, in a narrow bed in a bare room at the top of the house, under the slates, where the lowest servants slept, and for one moment you lie still in the last warmth you will feel for hours, and then you make yourself rise, because you must, because everything depends on it, because you are the one who lights the fire, and until you light it, nothing in this great house can begin. You rise, and the cold takes you at once. There is no fire up here, of course, no warmth of any kind, because a scullery maid's room was the barest in the house, a small space under the roof, with a narrow bed and a washstand, and little else, freezing in winter and stifling in summer, furnished with only what a servant strictly needed, and not one thing more. You swing your feet onto the bare floor, and the chill of it comes up through your soles. And you dress quickly in the dark, because to be slow is to be cold longer. And because the morning is already pressing on you, you dress by feel, in the black, the way you have learned to. The shift, the petticoats, the print dress that servants wore for the rough morning work, the plain washable stuff of it, because you are about to do the dirtiest jobs in the house, and there is no sense in good clothes for it. Over the dress, an apron, and not the neat white one, but a large coarse apron kept for the filthy work of the stoves and the scullery, the blacking and the scrubbing that would ruin anything finer. Your hair tied back and tucked up neatly beneath a cap, because appearance mattered even for the lowest servant, even at 5 in the morning, even with no one to see you, because that was the discipline of service, and it did not relax merely because it was dark and cold, and no one was watching. You were expected to be tidy. You were expected to be presentable. You were expected, in a phrase that captures the whole strange demand of your position, to be at once impeccable and invisible. Your bed must be made before you go down, even now, even in the dark, because that was the rule, and the rules did not bend. Within half an hour of waking, you must be downstairs and at your work, washed and dressed, and your room in order. And the half hour was not generous. So there is no dawdling, no sitting on the edge of the bed gathering yourself, no easing into the day. You wake, you rise, you dress, you make your bed, and you go. All of it quickly, all of it in the cold and the dark. And the day has you now, and will not let you go again until late tonight, when you climb back up these same stairs, long after the family have gone to bed, and fall into this same cold bed to sleep for a few short hours before it all begins again. You take up your candle, or your small lamp, the one small light that will be your only company for the next while, and you leave your room, and you begin to go down through the sleeping house. And here is a thing worth understanding about how these houses were built, because you feel it now, descending in the dark. You do not go down the grand staircase. You never go down the grand staircase. You go down the back stairs, the servants' stairs, the plain, narrow flights hidden away from the fine part of the house, because the whole architecture of a great house was arranged to keep servants out of sight, moving through the building by their own separate passages, so that the family need never encounter them at their work. There were houses with entire networks of these hidden stairs and corridors, built precisely so that the labor of the house could flow through it unseen. So you descend by the back way, the servants' way, down through the cold and quiet house, past the floors where the family lie sleeping in their warm beds behind their closed doors, down and down toward the very bottom of the house, where the kitchen waited. The house at this hour is a strange and silent place, and you know it in a way the family never will, because you move through it when it is empty and dark, and theirs only in name. They own it, but at 5 a.m. it is yours, in a sense, yours and the other early servants. A great dark, sleeping thing that you pass through on your way to wake it. You know its sounds at night, the settling of its timbers, the creak of a particular stair, the way the dark pools in the turnings of the passage. You know which boards complain and which are silent, and you have learned to move quietly, because a scullery maid who woke the house with her clatter would hear about it. So you go down softly, your one small light throwing its little glow on the walls, the rest of the house black around you, everyone above you asleep, and you alone awake and moving in the dark, going down to begin the day. And you reach the bottom at last, and you come into the kitchen, and it is exactly as cold and dead and dark as you knew it would be. This is the room you will spend your whole day in, the room that is, in a sense, the engine of the entire house, and at this hour it is silent and freezing, the great range a black shape against the wall, the fire in it long dead, the ashes of yesterday still in the grate. The copper pans hang dull and gleamless in the dark. The stone floor strikes cold through your shoes. The whole room waits, holding its breath, because a kitchen without its fire is a dead thing, useless, cold, capable of nothing, and it will remain a dead thing until you bring it to life. That is your first and most important task of the entire day, the task on which everything else depends: the lighting of the fire, the waking of the range, and to that we now turn, because until it is done, nothing else in this house can happen at all. The range is the heart of the kitchen, and you must understand what it was, because everything about your morning is shaped by it. The kitchen range was a great cast-iron cooking stove, a heavy black construction of ovens and hot plates, and a fire in its center, and it had, over the course of this century, replaced the old open hearth as the way a great kitchen cooked. It was a genuine piece of machinery, and a temperamental one, and it dominated the kitchen both physically and in the demands it made. It provided the heat for all the cooking, the ovens for the baking and roasting, the hot plates for the pots, and it heated as well the water for much of the house. Nothing in the kitchen happened without it. And it did not run itself. It had to be cleaned and fed and lit and tended and coaxed, and the whole of that labor in these early hours was yours. Before it can be lit, it must be cleaned, and this is the first hard, dirty work of your day, done in the cold before there is any warmth at all. You kneel down at the range, on the cold stone floor, and you begin. First, the old fire must be raked out, the ashes and clinker of yesterday's fire cleared away from the grate. And this is filthy work, the ash fine and grey and getting everywhere, into your hands, your apron, the air you breathe. You rake it out and carry it away, and clear the grate down to nothing. Then the range must be cleaned. And the range was cleaned in a particular and laborious way, because a cast-iron range left to itself would rust, and a good range was kept black and gleaming with a substance called blacklead, a black paste that was applied to the iron, and then brushed and polished until the whole great stove shone with a dull, dark luster. This blacking of the range was heavy, dirty, repetitive work, done on your knees, your hands filthy with the black paste, brushing and rubbing at the cold iron in the cold room. And it had to be done regularly, because the mistress or the cook would notice a neglected range, and a scullery maid was judged, in part, on how well the iron gleamed. Think for a moment about the strangeness of this, because it tells you something about the whole world you are living in tonight. Here you are, in the freezing dark, on your knees, polishing a stove until it shines, a stove that no member of the family will ever see, in a room they will never enter, and the shine you are working so hard to raise is for no one, or for almost no one, only for the cook and the housekeeper and the standards of the house itself. The labor is real and hard and cold, and its purpose is a gleam on a piece of iron in a basement that the people the whole house exists to serve do not know exists. This is the texture of a scullery maid's life. Enormous effort spent on things that would never be seen or thanked, poured into the invisible foundations of a comfort enjoyed entirely by others. With the range cleaned and blacked, you lay the new fire. And here is a real skill, one you have learned by doing it wrong and being scolded and doing it again until you got it right. A fire does not simply light because you wish it to. It must be built carefully in the right order, or it will not catch, or it will catch and die. And then the whole morning is thrown into crisis, because a range that will not light means no hot water, no cooking, no breakfast, nothing, and the delay would fall on your head. So you lay it properly. First the paper, twisted and crumpled. then the kindling, the small dry wood, arranged so the flame can climb through it and the air can move. Then, as it catches, the coal, added carefully, not smothering the young flame, but feeding it, building the fire up from a flicker to a blaze, until the coal itself is burning, and the fire is established and will hold. And you must get the range properly hot, not merely lit, but brought up to a good working heat, because everything that follows, the boiling and the baking and the cooking, needs real heat, and building that heat takes time, which is part of why you had to rise so early. The fire is not the end of your first task. It is only the beginning of the range's long, slow climb to the temperature the day's work demands. You kneel there in the dark, feeding the young fire, and slowly, the first change of the whole morning begins to happen. The fire catches and holds and grows, and with it comes the first warmth, the first light beyond your little candle. A real glow spreading from the grate, throwing its flicker on the copper pans and the stone walls and your own tired face. The kitchen, which was a dead cold black thing when you came down, begins, under your hands, to come alive. This is the moment your whole early rising was for. The moment the engine of the house turns over and begins to run. Everything upstairs, every comfort the family will enjoy today, traces back to this small flame you are nursing in the dark. And though no one will ever know it, and no one will ever thank you, you are, at this moment, the most important person in the entire house, because you are the one who has woken the fire. And until the fire is woken, the house cannot live. And with the fire going, your very next thought, before anything else, is water, because a great house ran on hot water almost as much as it ran on fire. And the getting of it was the next of your early tasks, and one of the heaviest. So even as the range climbs toward its working heat, you turn to the water, and to the great labor of filling and heating and carrying that shaped so much of a servant's morning. And that is where we go next. Let us step aside for a moment, while the fire climbs toward its heat, into the cold rooms off the kitchen where the food of the house was kept, because a great kitchen was surrounded by a whole geography of storage and provision. And understanding it shows you how a house of this kind fed itself, and how much work stood behind even the raw materials of a meal. The larder was the heart of this cold geography, the room where the perishable food was kept, and it was built to be cold, stone-floored, north-facing, thick-walled, shaded, because in an age before refrigeration, the only way to keep food was to keep it cool and airy, and to use it before it spoiled. Here hung the meat and the game. Here the butter and the milk and the cheese were kept. Here the things that would turn in warmth were stored in the coolest space the house could contrive. And keeping the larder was a real discipline, because food that spoiled was food wasted and money lost, and the mistress of the house, or the housekeeper, or the cook, watched the larder carefully. And a scullery maid learned that the cold rooms and their contents were treated with respect, because what they held was valuable and perishable, and not to be squandered. There were other stores besides, the dry goods, the flour and sugar, and rice and dried fruit and spices, kept in their own cupboards and bins, often under lock, because these too were valuable and consumed in quantity. The great house bought many of these things in bulk, and stored them, and drew on them as the cooking required, so that the kitchen was fed not by daily shopping for each meal, but by a standing store constantly drawn down and replenished. And someone kept account of it all, guarded it, guarded especially against the quiet pilfering that was a constant temptation in a house where the poor worked daily amid such plenty. A little tea taken here, a little sugar there. The small thefts that a careful housekeeper watched for, and a careless one lost a fortune, 2 over the years. Consider where all this food came from, because it connects the kitchen to a whole world beyond the house. Some of it came from the tradesman, the butcher and the baker and the grocer and the fishmonger and the rest, who supplied the house and called at the kitchen door, the back door, the tradesman's entrance, never the front, because tradesmen, like servants, did not use the family's door. The daily traffic of provisions came in this way. The deliveries at the kitchen door, the goods received and checked and carried in and stored. And this, too, was part of the kitchen's morning. The arrival of the day's supplies. The bread, perhaps, if it was not baked at home. The meat, the fish, whatever the day's meals required that the house did not itself produce. And in a house with land, with a garden, and perhaps a home farm, much came from the estate itself, the vegetables and fruit from the kitchen garden, the eggs and milk and butter from the farm, the game from the woods, a house of any size aiming to supply as much of its own table as it could, and buying in the rest. So the food that you would presently be trimming and washing and preparing had its own long history before it ever reached your hands, grown or raised or caught somewhere, brought to the house, received at the kitchen door, stored in the cold larder or the dry cupboards, and drawn out now, this morning, to be made into the family's meals. And all along that chain was labor, the labor of the gardeners and the farm workers and the tradesmen and the delivery boys and the person who received and stored it all, a whole invisible economy of provision standing behind the simple fact of food on a plate. The lady upstairs eating her breakfast egg was at the end of a long chain of hands. The hen, the farm worker, the person who collected it, the person who carried it, the cook who cooked it, and you who fetched it from the larder and would presently wash the pan it was cooked in, a single egg, and all those hands, and she would eat it without a thought, as one does, as we all do, because the whole point of the chain was to deliver the egg to her plate, and make all the hands that brought it there disappear. You fetch what the cook wants from the larder, then, stepping into that cold room with your light, the meat and the butter, and whatever the morning's cooking requires, and you carry it back into the warming kitchen, and the cold of the larder clings to it for a moment before the kitchen's heat takes over. The stores are opened, the day's provisions drawn, and the kitchen, supplied now from its cold surrounding rooms, turns to the real work of cooking, and you turn back to your own labor, the fetching and the washing and the preparing. That is your endless portion. But the cold rooms are worth remembering, the larder and the stores, because they are part of the kitchen's world, the cold pantry geography that fed the warm working heart. And a scullery maid knew every corner of them, because she was forever being sent to fetch from them, in and out of the cold and the warm, all the long day through. Water, in a house like this, did not come from a tap at the turn of a hand, or not hot water, and not everywhere it was needed. It had to be fetched, and heated, and carried, and this was among the heaviest and most constant labour of the whole household, and much of it, in these early hours, fell to you. The family upstairs would want hot water for washing when they woke, every bedroom needing it, and the kitchen itself needed water in quantity for the cooking and the endless washing up, and all of it had to be got hot, and getting it hot meant the fire, and the fire you had just lit. So you fill the kettles and set them on the range to heat, and you see to the boiler, the great vessel that heated water in bulk, filling it so that there would be hot water enough for the morning's demands. And the filling itself was labour, because the water had to be pumped or carried from wherever the house's supply came. And water is heavy, genuinely heavy, and a scullery maid spent a great deal of her strength simply moving it about, buckets and cans of it, to the range, to the boiler, to wherever it was wanted. Pumping water was one of the heavy tasks that fell to the scullery maid. The plain, muscular work of hauling the house's water up and moving it where it needed to go. And it was the kind of labour that told on a young body over the years, the lifting and carrying that bent backs and roughened hands and wore people down, the hot water that a lady upstairs would presently splash into her china basin, so lightly, so thoughtlessly, without a moment's wonder at where it came from, had been pumped and heated and carried by you, in the dark, before she stirred. Here is a thing worth stopping on, because the numbers tell a story, and the number in question is your wage. What were you paid for all of this, for the early rising, and the fire lighting, and the water carrying, and the long day of scrubbing that lay ahead? A scullery maid, the lowest servant in the house, earned in these years something in the region of 12 to 18 pounds a year. A year. 12 to 18 pounds for a year of this, of rising before dawn every day, and working until late every night, of the hardest and dirtiest labour the house had to offer. Now, that wage came with your board and your lodging, your food and your bed, such as they were, so it was not quite as bare as it sounds, and for a girl from a poor family, it was a real position, a real living, better than some of the alternatives. But set the number beside a few others and see what it tells you. A kitchen maid, a step above you, might earn 20 pounds. The cook at the top of the kitchen, a skilled professional, might earn 40 pounds, or 50, or as much as 70 for a very good one. And beyond the kitchen, beyond the house, an ordinary clergyman might have 140 pounds a year, and a comfortable middle-class household might live on anywhere from a few hundred to 1,000 pounds a year. And the wealthy family upstairs, the ones whose fire you have just lit, commanded thousands. You are at the very bottom of a very tall ladder, and the distance from your 12 pounds to the family's thousands is the distance across the whole of Victorian society. And you are standing in your coarse apron at the very foot of it, lighting their fire. But here is the other side of that number, and it matters, because it would be too simple to see only the hardship. That ladder, tall as it was, could be climbed, and the kitchen was one of the few places a poor girl could climb it. You began as a scullery maid, the lowest, but above you was the kitchen maid, and above her the cook. And those positions were real, reachable, a genuine path upward for a girl with the strength and the skill and the luck to rise, a scullery maid who worked hard, who watched and learned, who was fortunate enough to serve under a good kitchen maid and a clever cook, could pick up the skills of cookery, could rise in time to kitchen maid, and then, perhaps, in the fullness of years, to cook herself. And a good cook was a valued and well-paid servant, respected, secure, earning many times what the scullery maid began on. There were women who started as children, scrubbing pots for a few pounds a year, and ended as cooks commanding 60, running a kitchen of their own. And that possibility, that ladder, was real. And it was one of the things that made the hard beginning bearable, the knowledge that the bottom need not be forever, that the scullery was a place you might rise out of if you were good enough and lasted long enough. You are at the bottom tonight. But the bottom, in the kitchen, was also the first rung, so the water heats on the range, the kettles beginning their slow climb toward the boiler warming, and the kitchen grows steadily less cold as the fire builds and the heat spreads. And already, with the fire lit and the water heating, your first great tasks of the morning are done, the tasks that had to be finished before anyone else came down, the foundation laid for everyone else's day. But you are far from finished, because the kitchen must now be made properly ready, cleaned and set in order for the cook's arrival, and the first food of the day must be begun. And there is the matter of the bread, and the scullery waits, cold and grey, with its own hard labour. The fire is only the beginning. Let us go on into the next of the morning's work, as the kitchen slowly warms and the black windows begin, very faintly, to think about the dawn. Let us go now into the room you are named for, the scullery, because it was your particular domain, the place where the lowest and hardest work of the kitchen was done. And it tells you, better than anything, what your life actually was. The kitchen was where the cooking happened, the warm, bright, important room. The scullery was the room next to it, or behind it, smaller, plainer, colder, where the dirty work went on, the washing and the scouring and the rough preparation, out of sight of the finer business of the kitchen proper. And the scullery was your place above all others, the place you would return to again and again through the day, up to your elbows in water, scrubbing. The scullery was not a comfortable room. It was often the coldest and dampest in the whole house, a stone-floored space built for water and mess, with a great sink or two, and little else in the way of comfort. The floor was frequently wet, because the work was wet, and the cold came up through it, and the damp hung in the air. And it was such an unpleasant place to stand for hours, that scullery maids sometimes stood on slatted wooden mats laid over the stone, to keep their feet up out of the standing water, and away from the worst of the cold. Picture that, the small detail of it. A girl standing on a wooden slat above a wet stone floor in a cold, damp room, hour after hour, because the floor itself was too cold and too wet to stand on directly. That was the scullery. That was where you worked. And what you did there, more than anything else, was wash. The washing up of a great house was a labour almost beyond imagining, because a wealthy family and its kitchen generated a staggering quantity of dirty things. Every pot and pan the cook used, and she used many, came to you to be scoured. Every dish, every plate, every bowl and cup and utensil came to you, the great copper pans and the iron pots, caked and greasy from cooking, had to be scoured out with sand or with harsh abrasives and hard scrubbing, because there were no easy modern soaps and no machines, only your hands and hot water and grit and effort. The pans had to be got perfectly clean, scoured until they gleamed, dried so they would not rust, made ready to use again, and there was no end to them, because as fast as you cleaned one lot, the cooking produced another. All through the day, the dirty things came to the scullery, and all through the day you washed them, and the pile never truly ended, because a kitchen in use is a kitchen constantly dirtying its tools. Consider what this did to your hands, because the body pays for this kind of work. And the scullery maid's hands told the story of her days, hours in hot water, hours in the cold and damp, the harsh scouring materials, the grease and the grit, all of it worked on the skin of your hands until they were red and raw and rough and cracked, the hands of someone who spends her life in water and abrasives. A young girl's hands ruined early, and they would not recover as long as the work continued, because the work did not stop. This was the physical cost of the position, written on the body, the raw hands, the aching back from the lifting and the carrying, and the endless bending over the sink, the feet cold and damp from the scullery floor, the whole young frame bent to labor that used it hard. And you were, remember, often very young, a girl of 12 or 14 in some cases. A child, really, doing this groan and grinding work. Your childhood spent on your knees at the range, and your feet at the scullery sink. And here is the particular cruelty of your place in the household. The thing that set the scullery maid apart, even from the other servants. You were the lowest, and you were treated as the lowest, even below stairs, even among the servants themselves. When the servants took their meals together in the servants' hall, in the ordered ranks of the below-stairs world, you very often did not sit with them, because you could not, because you had to remain in the kitchen to watch the food that was still cooking, to tend the fire, to be on hand. The scullery maid ate apart in the kitchen, snatching her food, while she kept an eye on the pots, excluded even from the community of the servants' table, which had its own strict hierarchy, in which you sat at the very bottom. When you sat at all, you were looked down upon by people who were, themselves, looked down upon by the family. You were the servant of servants, fetching and carrying and cleaning for the kitchen maid and the cook, the bottom of the bottom. And you knew it, because everyone around you reminded you of it in 100 small daily ways. This is worth sitting with, because it reveals how the whole system worked, how it reached all the way down, and how everyone in it, however low, had someone lower to look down upon, except you, at the very bottom, who had no one. The family looked down on the servants. Among the servants, the upper servants looked down on the lower. Among the lower servants, the kitchen maid stood above the scullery maid. And the scullery maid stood at the very foot of it all, the youngest, the poorest, the hardest worked, the least regarded, the one who rose first and slept last and ate alone and scrubbed the pots that everyone else dirtied. It was a hard place to stand, and yet you stood there and did the work because it was a living, and because there was a ladder above you if you could climb it, and because for a poor girl in 1885 there were not many better places to be, hard as this one was. But the morning presses on, and there is more to do than wash, because the kitchen must be made ready for the cook, who will be down soon, and the first food of the day must be started. And above all, there is the bread, the breakfast bread that a great house expected fresh and warm, and that meant dough, and dough meant an early start of its own. So let us leave the scullery for now, its sink waiting, and turn to the making of the morning's bread, and the arrival soon of the woman who ruled the kitchen and ruled you. Look around the kitchen now, at the tools of it, the great array of pots and pans and implements that hung on the walls and filled the shelves, because the equipment of a Victorian kitchen was considerable, and it was your particular charge to keep it clean. And there is a whole world in it worth knowing. The most striking of it, to any eye, was the copper. A well-appointed kitchen possessed a great range of copper pans and pots and moulds, and they hung on the walls in graduated rows, gleaming from great stock pots down to small saucepans, a whole battery of vessels for every purpose that cookery required. Copper was prized because it conducted heat beautifully and evenly, which made it excellent for cooking. And a full set of good copper was a real investment, a valuable thing, a mark of a serious kitchen. But copper had a cost beyond its price, and the cost was labor, because copper tarnished. And worse, the bare copper that touched food had to be kept scrupulously clean and properly lined, since copper wrongly used could taint or even poison food, and so the copper had to be cleaned constantly and carefully, scoured and polished and kept in perfect order. And whose task was that scouring? Yours. The gleaming rows of copper that made the kitchen so handsome were kept gleaming by the scullery maid, hour upon hour of scouring, so that the beauty of the battery of copper was, like the gleam of the range, a thing raised by your raw hands and your endless effort. Beyond the copper, there was iron, the heavy iron pots and pans that did much of the rough cooking. And these too had their care, scoured and dried and kept from rust. There were the moulds, sometimes elaborate, for the jellies and creams and shaped dishes that a fine table displayed, intricate copper and tin moulds that produced the towering ornamental confections the Victorians loved. There were the tools of preparation, the knives and cleavers, the sieves and colanders, the rolling pins and boards, the whisks and spoons, the great array of specialized implements that a serious cookery required, each with its purpose, each needing to be kept clean and ready. There were the vessels of the range, the kettles and the stock pots, and the fish kettles and the rest. The kitchen was full of equipment, dozens upon dozens of items, hundreds perhaps in a great house, and every one of them, when it was used, came to the scullery to be cleaned, and every one of them had to be kept in good order, ready for use at any moment, because a kitchen might be called upon at short notice and could not be caught with its tools dirty. Here is something worth pausing on, because it changes how you see the gleaming kitchen. When we look now at a preserved Victorian kitchen, at a great house opened to visitors, we see the rows of copper and the ranks of moulds and the polished range, and we find it beautiful, and we admire the craftsmanship and the abundance of it, the handsome completeness of a fully equipped kitchen. And it is beautiful. But every gleaming surface in that beautiful room represents labor, human labor, hands scouring and polishing and drying, and most of that labor was the scullery maid's. The beauty we admire is the visible residue of somebody's aching hours. The copper gleams because a girl scoured it. The range shines because a girl blacked it. The whole handsome order of the kitchen was maintained daily by hard, hidden work. And when we admire it, we are, without knowing it, admiring the results of her labor, though we almost never think of her, the girl who made it gleam, any more than the family did. There was a real skill in the care of all this equipment worth acknowledging, because it was not merely dumb scrubbing, knowing how to clean copper properly without damaging it, how to keep iron from rust, how to scour without scratching, how to keep each kind of vessel in its proper condition. This was knowledge, learned by doing, part of the craft of the kitchen that the scullery maid absorbed along with everything else, and the care of the tools connected to the whole discipline of the kitchen. The insistence on order, on readiness, on everything clean and in its place, because a well-run kitchen was an ordered kitchen, and disorder in the kitchen meant disaster in the cooking. And so the endless cleaning and ordering of the equipment was not busy work, but the very foundation of the kitchen's ability to do its job. Your scouring, tedious and hard as it was part of what made fine cooking possible, and the cook, however she treated you, depended utterly on the clean, ready tools that your labor provided. So the copper gleams on the walls, and the iron sits ready, and the molds wait on their shelves, and the whole battery of the kitchen stands in its polished order, maintained by you, ready for the day's cooking. And the cooking now is well underway, the cook and the kitchen maid at their work, the dishes taking shape, and as fast as they use the pans come to you, and the great tide of washing rises, and your day settles into its rhythm, the rhythm of the scullery, the endless cleaning of the tools of a labor that was not yours to perform, but only yours to clean up after. Let us go on into the fuller morning as the dawn comes up at last over the waking house. The bread of a great house was expected fresh, and in many kitchens the breakfast rolls and loaves were baked that very morning, which meant the dough had to be ready in time. And the readying of dough is not a quick thing, because dough must rise, and rising cannot be hurried. Often the dough was set the night before, left to prove slowly overnight, so it would be ready to work and bake in the morning. But if it had not been set the night before, then one of your very first tasks, once the fire was going, was to set the dough, to mix and knead it and leave it to rise, so that later, when it had proved, it could be shaped and baked and sent up warm to the family's table. The bread was one of the things the range's early heat was for, and one of the reasons the whole timing of the morning ran as tight as it did, because bread has its own clock, indifferent to yours, and if the dough is not started in time, there will be no fresh bread when the family come down, and that, in a house with any standards, was not acceptable. So you see to the dough, if it is yours to see to, your hands in the flour and the water, mixing and working it in the growing warmth of the kitchen, and you set it near the range to rise, covered in the warmth, where it will slowly swell and lighten while the rest of the morning's work goes on around it. There is something almost companionable about the dough, rising quietly in its bowl while you move about the kitchen. A slow, patient process, keeping its own time in the corner. The one thing in the whole frantic morning that cannot be rushed, and simply takes what it takes. And the smell of it, presently, as it proves, and then as it bakes, will be one of the first good things in the kitchen's long day. The warm, yeasty smell of rising and baking bread filling the room. A smell that meant the kitchen was truly alive now, truly working. The cold, dead room of a few hours ago, wholly transformed. By now the kitchen has changed utterly from the black, cold space you came down to. The fire is roaring in the range, throwing real heat and light. The water is hot, steaming in its kettles and its boiler. The room is warm now, or warming, the chill driven back into the corners. Lamps are lit, the kitchen bright. The dough is rising, the first pots perhaps beginning. The copper pans catch the firelight and gleam. The dead room has become a living one, and it has become so under your hands, in the dark, while the house slept. And this transformation, from cold tomb to warm heart, was the scullery maid's first great gift to the house each day, given before dawn, unseen. And it is into this warm and waking kitchen, this room you have brought to life, that the cook now descends, and with her arrival, the kitchen enters its next phase, and you move from being its solitary tender to being the lowest hand in a working brigade. The cook was the ruler of the kitchen, and you must understand her power, because she governed your day. In a house like this, she was a skilled professional, very possibly a woman who had risen herself through exactly the path that lay above you, from scullery maid to kitchen maid to cook, and who now commanded the kitchen with the authority that skill and position gave her. She was answerable for the family's food, for the success of every meal, for the reputation of the house's table, and that was a heavy responsibility, and she carried it, and she ruled her kitchen firmly, because a kitchen that produced fine food on time, every day, for a demanding family, could only be run firmly. She could be kind, some cooks were, or she could be harsh, many were, and either way her word in the kitchen was very nearly law, and you, the scullery maid, were the lowest under her command, the one who did whatever she directed, fetched whatever she wanted, cleaned whatever she used. Between the cook and you, in a larger kitchen, stood the kitchen maid, and the three of you formed the kitchen's small hierarchy, its chain of command. The cook directed. The kitchen maid did the substantial cooking work under the cook's eye, the real preparation and cooking of dishes, learning as she went the skills that would one day make her a cook herself, and you, the scullery maid, served them both, doing the rough preliminary work, the washing and scouring and fetching and carrying, the trimming and washing of the vegetables, the plucking and cleaning, all the heavy, dirty preparation that fed into the cooking the others did. You were the base of the pyramid, the one whose labor supported the skilled work above. And you learned, watching them, watching the kitchen maid work and the cook direct, absorbing the craft of the kitchen without anyone formally teaching it to you, storing it up against the day you might rise to do it yourself. The kitchen was a school as well as a workplace, a hard school, but a real one. And the scullery maid who kept her eyes open was serving an apprenticeship of a kind, unpaid and unacknowledged, but real, learning her trade from the bottom up. So the cook is down now, and the kitchen maid, and the kitchen's full day begins, the three of you at your stations, the hierarchy in motion, the great task of feeding the whole house getting underway. And the first and most pressing object of all that labor is the family's breakfast. That lavish spread the family would presently come down to, and behind it, less visible but just as necessary, the feeding of the whole staff of the house, the servants' own breakfast, because an army of servants had to be fed too before it could work. The kitchen fed everyone, upstairs and down, and the making of the morning's food, in its two very different forms, is where we go next, as the black windows of the kitchen begin, at last, to grey toward the coming dawn. The dawn comes at last. It comes slowly, greyly, at the high, small windows of the kitchen, which sat low in the house, half below the level of the ground, so that its windows looked out at the world from beneath, at the feet of things, catching the light late and grudgingly. But it comes, the black of the windows softening to grey, then to a paler grey, then to the first thin colour of the day. And though the kitchen has been awake and working for hours in its own lamplit world, there is something in the arrival of the real dawn that marks a turning. The outer world waking now to join the inner one that has been labouring since long before. And with the dawn, the rest of the house begins to wake, the other servants rising now to their own day's work, the household filling with the quiet, early movement of people at their tasks. The housemaids are up, going about the family's rooms, doing for the upstairs what you have done for the kitchen, lighting the fires in the family's grates, one after another, so that the family would wake to warm rooms, cleaning and dusting and setting the reception rooms to rights before the family came down, carrying the hot water you heated up to the bedrooms for the family's washing. They too had risen early, though not as early as you, and they too worked in the cold morning to have the house ready before the family stirred. The whole downstairs population of the house labouring in concert in these early hours, toward the single end of presenting the family when they woke with a warm and ordered and functioning world. There was a whole hierarchy of them waking and working now, the house's population sorting itself into its ranks and stations. The housekeeper, the senior woman of the house, rising to her authority, the keys of the house at her waist, overseeing the female staff and the stores and the smooth running of the whole establishment. The butler, if the house kept one, seeing to his own domain, the silver and the cellar, and the male servants, and the ordering of the house's public rooms, the housemaids at their cleaning and fire lighting, the lady's maid and the valet, waiting to attend the mistress and master when they woke, to dress them and see to their clothes, the footmen, if there were footmen, turning out in their livery for the day's service, the whole staff of the house, each in their place, each at their work, a small population rising in the dark to serve a handful of people, and all of it, in a sense, resting on the foundation you had laid, because you had lit the fire that heated the water that the housemaids carried up. You had woken the kitchen that would feed them all, and presently, as the family began to wake, the bells would begin. Through the house ran the bell system, the wires and the bells by which the family summoned servants. A bell pull in every important room connected to a board of bells in the servants' quarters, each labelled with its room, so that when a member of the family pulled a cord, a bell rang below, and the servants knew instantly which room required attention. And as the family woke, the bells would start, one and then another, the family beginning to make their wants known, ringing for this and that, for hot water, for attention, for whatever they required. And the servants would answer, climbing the stairs to the family's world to see what was wanted. The bells were the voice of the family reaching down into the working house, and they rang all day, from the family's waking to their sleeping, the constant summons of the served calling the servers, and the beginning of the bells in the morning meant the family were awake now, and the day's direct service had begun. You hear the house waking around you and above you, the footsteps, the movement, the first bells, the whole building stirring into its day. And you are, in a sense, at the bottom of all of it, the deepest and earliest and lowest, the one who woke first in the dark and lit the first fire and set the whole thing in motion. The house rises in layers, and you are the bottom layer, the foundation, the first to wake and the last to sleep, and everything above you, the housemaids and the hot water and the fires and the breakfast, and the family themselves in their warm waking rooms. All of it rests on the work you did alone in the dark before any of them stirred. You do not think of it in these terms, most likely, being far too busy and too tired to philosophize about your place in the order of things. But it is true, whether you think it or not, that the great house wakes upward from the kitchen, from the fire, from you, and that the comfort spreading now through all its floors began with a cold girl kneeling at a dark grate hours ago, in the silence, alone. The kitchen is in full daylight now, or what daylight its low windows allowed, and in full work, the cooking well advanced, the breakfast going up, the house awake and ringing and moving all around. The long morning is turning toward the middle of the day, and your labor goes on, the washing and the fetching and the scouring, without pause, because there is no pause, because the kitchen does not rest, and neither do you. But before we follow the day into its later hours, let us turn and look properly at you, at the girl at the center of all this labor, at who she was and where she came from, and how she came to be here, on her knees in the dark before dawn, because she was a real kind of person, and she deserves to be seen. There was one daily meeting between the two worlds of the house that is worth watching, because it shows the strange line where the family's world touched the kitchen's, and it happened in the morning, once the family were up. The mistress of the house, the lady of the family, would consult with the cook about the meals of the day, and this consultation was one of the few points at which the family's world reached directly down into the kitchen. And it reveals a great deal about how the whole household was run, and where its authority lay. The mistress did not cook, of course, and in a grand house she might rarely enter the kitchen itself, but she was, in principle, the manager of the household, and the planning of the meals was her responsibility, exercised through the cook. So each morning there would be a conference, the mistress and the cook together, over the menus, what would be eaten that day, at luncheon and at dinner, what dishes, what courses, adjusted for whether there were to be guests, for what was in season, for what the larder held, for the family's tastes and the demands of any entertaining. The cook would propose, the mistress would decide, or they would settle it between them, the cook's expertise guiding the mistress's authority, and out of this daily conference came the marching orders for the kitchen's whole day, the meals that you and the kitchen maid and the cook would then spend the day producing. This meeting is worth pausing on because it shows the peculiar position of the mistress, who was at once powerful and idle, the manager who did no work. She commanded the kitchen, in the sense that the meals were produced at her direction and to her approval, and she held real authority over the cook, and through the cook over you. And yet she did nothing herself, in the physical sense, nothing of the actual labor, her management consisting of decisions and directions handed down to the people who would carry them out. She was the head of a productive enterprise in which she performed no production, her role purely that of direction and oversight and the setting of standards. This was the position of the lady of the house generally. A manager of labor she did not share, and the morning menu conference was its daily enactment, the lady deciding what the kitchen would make, the kitchen making it, the lady enjoying it, the making itself entirely in other hands. And there was money in this too, because the mistress or the housekeeper, acting for her, kept the household accounts, and the feeding of the house was a considerable expense that had to be managed. The provisions cost money, the meat and the fish and the groceries and all the rest, and a great house spent heavily on its table, and someone had to keep track of it all, to order and to pay and to account, to guard against waste and against the padding of bills and the pilfering of stores. So the management of the kitchen was, among other things, a matter of accounts, of the careful control of what was spent on feeding the household, and the mistress or housekeeper watched this closely, because a kitchen was a place where money could leak away in 100 small ways, and keeping the cost of the table within bounds was part of the real work of running a house. You, at the bottom, saw little of this directly, but it shaped your world, because the discipline of the stores, the watching of waste, the insistence that nothing be squandered, all descended from this concern with the accounts, and a scullery maid learned quickly that the food and the provisions were watched and counted, and not to be treated carelessly. Consider the distance, the sheer distance, between the mistress in her morning conference and you at your sink, because it was the distance of the whole age compressed into a single house. She was a lady, wealthy, leisured, powerful within her sphere, deciding the day's menus in a warm room, her hands soft, her day her own to arrange. You were a poor girl, a child perhaps, at the very bottom, your hands raw, your day entirely commanded by others, your labor endless, and you were connected, the two of you, by a chain of authority that ran from her decision through the cook to your work, so that the meals she chose became the pans you scoured, her leisure and your labor bound together in the single machine of the house. You might rarely see her, might barely know her, might catch only glimpses of her through the whole years of your service. And yet she governed your days, her choices shaping your labor, her comfort resting on your work, the two of you living in the same house and in entirely different worlds, joined and divided at once, as the whole society was joined and divided, the served and the serving under a single roof, the menu settled, the day's orders given. The mistress returns to her own world, to her leisured morning, and the cook turns to the kitchen with the day's marching orders, and the labor resumes, aimed now at the meals that have been decided somewhere above your head, and you, who had no part in the deciding, take up your share of the making, the fetching, and the washing, and the preparing, because that was your place, to make what others chose, to labor at the bottom of a machine whose direction lay entirely at the top. So the kitchen bends to its day's work, and you bend with it, and the long hours go on, toward the luncheon and the dinner and the late night still ahead. The family's breakfast, in a wealthy Victorian house, was a substantial and generous thing, and preparing it was the kitchen's first great performance of the day. This was not a light continental affair of a roll and coffee. The breakfast of a prosperous English family was a spread, laid out often on the sideboard in covered dishes kept warm, so that the family could come down at their leisure and serve themselves from an array of hot food. There might be eggs, done several ways. There might be bacon and sausages and kidneys and fish, kippers or kedgeree, and cold meats and toast in racks, and the fresh bread you had set to rise hours before, and butter and preserves, and tea and coffee. It was abundant, various, and hot, and all of it had to be ready for whenever the family chose to appear, which meant the kitchen worked to their convenience, producing a lavish hot breakfast at an hour the family set, and the kitchen simply had to meet. Every element of that breakfast represented labor, much of it yours, done in the hours before the family stirred. The fire you lit cooked it. The water you heated made the tea and coffee. The vegetables and other things you trimmed and washed and prepared fed into it. The bread you set rising was baked for it, and when it was cooked, it was carried up out of the kitchen, up the back stairs, into the family's world, and set out in the breakfast room in its warm covered dishes, appearing there as if it had simply materialized, hot and plentiful and ready, with no sign at all of the cold, dark kitchen and the laboring hands that had produced it. The family would come down and eat and never see the kitchen, never think of it, never wonder how the hot food came to be waiting for them. It was simply there, as it was always there, as it would always be there, produced by an invisible engine they did not trouble to imagine. And here, set the two breakfasts side by side, because the contrast tells the whole story of the house. The family's breakfast was lavish, hot, various, served in warm, bright rooms, eaten at leisure. And the servants' breakfast, the meal that fed the very people who had made the families, was a plainer thing altogether. The servants ate too, of course. They had to. An army cannot work unfed. And a well-run house fed its servants adequately, understanding that hungry servants worked badly. But the servants' breakfast was simpler, plainer fare, bread and butter and tea, perhaps some of the plainer cooked food, eaten quickly, in the servants' hall or the kitchen, in a pause snatched from the work, not lingered over, but got through, so that the labor could resume. The same kitchen produced both, the feast and the plain meal, the abundance for the few and the sufficiency for the many, and the hands that made the feast ate the plain meal. And that was simply how it was, understood by everyone, questioned by no one, the natural order of a world arranged in ranks. And you, the scullery maid, ate lowest even among the servants, as we have seen, very often not even at the servants' table, but alone in the kitchen, snatching your bread and tea while you watched the pots and tended the fire, because you could not be spared from the kitchen, and because your place was the lowest, and the lowest ate where and when they could. So there were, in a sense, 3 breakfasts in that house each morning, arranged in a descending order that mapped the whole society. The family's lavish spread, eaten at leisure in warm, bright rooms. The servants' plainer meal, eaten quickly in the hall, and the scullery maid's snatched bread, eaten alone in the kitchen with one eye on the cooking. 3 meals, 3 stations, the same morning, the same house, the distance between the top and the bottom, the distance across the whole of the age, and you at the very bottom of it, eating alone, having risen first and worked hardest. To feed the people who would never know your name. Sit with that contrast, but sit with it fairly, because it would be too easy to make it only a picture of cruelty, and the truth was more ordinary, and in some ways more troubling than simple cruelty. The family were not, most of them, wicked people gloating over a starving servant. They were ordinary people, raised from birth inside a world where this was simply how things were, where servants existed and did the work, and were fed and housed and paid a little, and where none of this seemed to them remarkable or wrong, because it was all they had ever known, and all anyone around them had ever known. They did not think about the scullery maid, because the whole architecture of the house, the back stairs, the hidden kitchen, the early hours, was designed precisely so that they would not have to think about her. The invisibility was built in, structural, deliberate, and so the injustice of it was not usually a matter of individual malice, but of a whole system arranged to keep the labor out of sight and out of mind, so thoroughly that the people it served could enjoy its fruits their whole lives without ever quite seeing the hands that produced them. That is a quieter kind of wrong than cruelty, and a deeper one, because it did not even require anyone to be cruel. It only required everyone to look away, and the house was built to help them. The family's breakfast goes up, then, hot in its covered dishes, carried by other hands than yours into the world above, where presently the family will come down and eat it and never think of you. And the servants snatch their plainer meal and return to their work. And you eat your bread alone in the kitchen quickly, and turn back to the sink, because the pots from the breakfast cooking are already waiting, and the day's great tide of washing up has only just begun to rise. The dawn is coming now, greying at the high windows. The house above is beginning to stir, and the kitchen, fully awake now, warm and bright and busy, settles into the long labor of its day. Let us stay a while longer and see what that day held, and what became of the girl at the bottom of it all. The kitchen was a dangerous place, and this is worth dwelling on, because the dangers were real and constant, and fell most heavily on the lowest workers. And they are easy to forget when we picture the cozy, glowing kitchen of the imagination. A Victorian kitchen was full of ways to be hurt, and the people who worked in it were hurt regularly, in ways large and small, and the scullery maid, doing the roughest work closest to the fire and the water and the heavy things, was as exposed to it as anyone. Begin with fire and heat, because the whole kitchen was organized around a great open source of both, the range burning hot all day, and around it the boiling water and the hot fat and the flames. Burns and scalds were the constant hazard of kitchen work, and everyone who worked there carried the marks of them, the small burns from the range, the scalds from spilled or splashed hot water, the spatter of hot fat, the grasped handle that proved hotter than expected. Working all day amid boiling pots and roaring fire and scalding water, in long skirts and with bare hands, meant a steady toll of minor injuries and the ever-present risk of a serious one. A pot of boiling water tipped, a fall against the hot range, a fire flaring up, and a girl could be badly hurt, scarred, disabled even. And there was little enough recourse if she was. No proper medical care as we would understand it. No compensation. Often little sympathy. An injured servant being chiefly a servant who could not work. And the long skirts were themselves a danger near the fire, because the clothing of the age was not made with kitchen safety in mind, and a skirt could catch, could brush too near a flame, and the terrible accidents of women's clothing catching fire were a real and dreaded hazard of the age, not only in kitchens, but everywhere there was open flame, and the kitchen had more flame than anywhere. It was a risk women lived with, the risk of their own clothing catching alight, and in the kitchen, bending and reaching around the fire all day, the risk was constant, and it was a real fear, and sometimes it came true, with dreadful results. Beyond the fire, there were the ordinary hazards of hard physical labor, the strains and injuries of lifting and carrying beyond what a young body should. The heavy pots, the buckets of water, the sacks and boxes of provisions, the constant lifting of heavy things took their toll on backs and joints and growing frames. There were the cuts from knives, an inevitable part of preparing food, some of them serious. There were falls on wet floors, on stairs, carrying heavy loads. There was the sheer wearing effect of the labor itself, the way that years of this work aged and damaged the body, the raw, ruined hands, the bad back, the feet and legs worn from standing, the general using up of a young body in hard service. The kitchen did not merely tire its workers. Over time it damaged them, and a woman who spent her youth in scullery and kitchen work carried the marks of it in her body for the rest of her life. And there was the matter of health more broadly, because the conditions of a servant's life carried their own risks. The cold, damp scullery, the sudden changes from the heat of the kitchen to the cold of the larder and back, the exhaustion of the long hours and the short sleep, all of it wore at the health of the people who lived it. A run-down, overworked, underslept young body was vulnerable to illness, and illness for a servant was a serious matter, because a servant who could not work was a problem, and a servant who fell seriously or lastingly ill might simply lose her place, be let go, sent away, because the household needed a servant who could do the work and had little use for one who could not. The security of service was real but conditional, conditional on the ability to keep working, and illness or injury could dissolve it in a moment, casting a girl out of her position and her home and her livelihood with little ceremony and less mercy. This is the harder truth beneath the picture of the cozy kitchen, that it was a place of real physical danger and real physical cost, and that the cost fell most heavily on the youngest and lowest, on the scullery maid doing the roughest and most exposed work. She risked burns and scalds every day. She strained her body with heavy labor. She worked amid genuine dangers, with little protection and less recourse if the dangers caught her. And she did it for her 12 or 18 pounds a year, at the bottom of the house, and if the work broke her health or the fire caught her skirt, or a heavy load ruined her back. That was, in the cold logic of the arrangement, her misfortune, and the house would find another girl. The kitchen was warm, and it fed the family beautifully, and it gleamed with copper, and it was also, for the people who worked in it, a place that could and did hurt them, and that used them hard, and that owed them little when it had used them up. You work on, then, amid these dangers, as amid everything else, careful of the fire, and the hot water, and the heavy things, bearing the small burns, and the aching back as the ordinary price of the day. Because there is no choice but to bear them, because the work must be done, and you are the one to do it, and the day goes on, the long middle and afternoon of it, the labor continuing without real pause, and evening will come, and the family's dinner, the great performance of the kitchen's day, and more work beyond it, until at last, late, you climb again to your cold attic. Let us follow the day to its end, and then look back at the whole of it, before we let you, and the kitchen, and the whole vanished world of it go quiet at last. Let us pause in the fullness of the morning, and simply be in the kitchen for a moment, in the thick of its working life, because a kitchen at full work was a place of powerful sensation, and the scullery maid lived inside all of it, and it is worth feeling, for a breath, what it was actually like to stand in that room as it labored. There was the heat, first of all, the great heat of the range radiating out into the room, so that the kitchen that had been so bitterly cold before dawn became, by the middle of the morning, almost too warm, the fire roaring, the ovens hot, the steam rising from the pots, the whole room thick with warmth, so that a worker might go from shivering at 5 in the morning to sweating by 10. The temperature of the scullery maid's day swinging from one extreme toward the other, as the fire she had lit did its work. And there was the steam, rising from the boiling pots, and the hot washing water, hanging in the air, fogging the low windows, making the kitchen a humid and clouded place in the heat of its work. There were the smells, layered and constant and changing through the day. The smell of the fire, the coal and the wood smoke, the smell of the bread, that warm, yeasty richness as it baked, one of the finest smells the kitchen produced, the smells of the cooking, the roasting meat, the simmering stocks, the frying, the whole savory cloud of a kitchen preparing food in quantity, rich and heavy and everywhere. And beneath the good smells, the less good ones, the smell of the grease and the dirty washing water, the smell of the drains, the raw smell of the meat and the game in preparation, the mingled odor of a place where food was worked in bulk. Not all of it pleasant, some of it strong and low, the underside of all that cooking. The scullery maid lived in this shifting cloud of smell all day, the fine and the foul together, the bread and the grease, the roasting meat and the dirty water. And there were the sounds, the kitchen never quiet in its working hours. The roar and crackle of the fire, the bubble and hiss of the pots, the chop and scrape of preparation, the knife on the board, the spoon in the bowl, the clatter of the pans, the ring of copper and iron, the endless clink and rattle of the washing up, your own particular music, the sound of dishes and pots moving through water and against each other all day long, the voices, the cook's directions sharp above the noise, the talk and occasional laughter of the servants, the calling back and forth of a working kitchen, the bells ringing from above, the family's summons cutting through the kitchen's noise, and under it all, the constant background of labor, of things being done, a room full of work making the sound that work makes, from before dawn to late at night. This was the sensory world the scullery maid inhabited, hour after hour, the heat and the steam, and the smells and the din of a great kitchen at full work. And she was so deep inside it, so accustomed to it, that she likely ceased to notice it at all, the way we cease to notice the constant conditions of our own daily lives. But it was intense, this world, a place of strong sensation, warm and loud and thick with smell, alive with heat and steam and noise, and to step into it from the cold, quiet dark of the early morning was to step into a different element entirely, the kitchen fully awake, roaring with its own life, the dead cold room of before dawn transformed utterly into this hot, loud, fragrant engine of labor. And you stood inside it all day at your sink, in the heat and the steam and the noise and the smell, washing, always washing, at the sensory heart of the working house. Who was she, this girl at the bottom of the great house, kneeling in the dark before dawn? Let us turn and look at her properly, because she was a real kind of person, hundreds of thousands of her, and behind the role of scullery maid was always an actual child or young woman with a history and a family and a life, and it is worth seeing her as that, not merely as a function of the kitchen. She was very often young, sometimes very young, a girl of 12 or 13 or 14 when she first went into service, a child by our reckoning, sent out from home to work, while still barely more than a little girl. And she came almost always from a poor family, because service was the destiny of the poor, and the scullery was the entry point for the poorest and least connected of the girls who went into it. She might come from the countryside, from a labouring family on the land, one of many children in a cottage, where there was not enough to go around, sent into service in part because it was the expected path for a girl of her class, and in part simply because it was one less mouth for her family to feed, and a few pounds a year sent home, or at least a child provided for. Or she might come from a poor family in a town, from the crowded streets, into service as the best available option in a hard world. Either way, she came from want, from a family that could not keep her in idleness and had no better future to offer her. And service, hard as it was a roof and food and a wage and a place. And for a poor girl, that was not nothing. Imagine what it was for such a child to arrive in a great house. She had grown up, very likely, in a small, poor home, and now she found herself in an enormous house full of rooms she would never enter, amid a wealth beyond anything she had known, surrounded by people whose lives were unimaginably comfortable, and she was the lowest of all of them. A small, frightened girl in a strange, vast place, set to hard work among strangers, far from her family, sleeping in a cold attic in a house that was not home. The homesickness of young servants was real and often acute. Children torn from their families and set down alone in the strange world of a great house, missing their mothers, crying in their attic beds, adjusting as children do because they must, but paying a real price in loneliness for the position that was supposed to be their good fortune. She was brave, this girl, braver than we usually credit, a child doing hard adult work far from home, and mostly bearing it, because there was nothing else to do but bear it. And she worked this child in a way that we would now find shocking for someone so young. The long days, the hard labor, the early rising, and the late sleeping, the physical toll of it on a growing body. There were no real protections for her of the kind we would expect, no limits on her hours worth speaking of, no one much concerned that a child was doing such work, because it was simply normal, the ordinary lot of poor children who had always worked and were expected to work, in the fields, in the factories, in the mines, in the kitchens, wherever the labor of the poor was needed. A childhood for the poor was short, and a poor girl passed quickly from being a child at home to being a worker in someone else's house, and the scullery maid was one of the great multitude of children whose young years were given over to labor so that their families might survive and their betters might be comfortable. But let us not paint her only as a victim, because she would not have thanked us for it, and it would not be the whole truth. She had, this girl, her own life even here, her own small world below stairs, her own friendships perhaps with the other servants, her own moments of rest, and even of pleasure snatched from the hard days. Servants had their half-days off, rare and precious, and their occasional outings, and their gossip, and their jokes, and their small kindnesses to one another. And the below-stairs world, for all its hierarchy and its hardship, was a human world, with warmth in it as well as toil. And she had her hopes, her ambitions even, because, as we have seen, there was a ladder above her, and a girl with spirit might set her eye on climbing it, might mean to rise, to become a kitchen maid, and then a cook, to make something of herself in the one arena open to her. She was not merely acted upon. She had her own will, her own plans, her own sense of herself as a person with a future, however constrained that future was. And to see her only as a poor, exploited child would be to miss the real girl, who was tougher and more alive and more herself than that picture allows. She is a person, in short, this scullery maid, not a symbol, not merely an example of Victorian labor, but an actual young human being, with a home she missed, and a family she came from, and hopes she carried, and a hard day's work in front of her, kneeling now in the warming kitchen at her endless tasks. And when we watch her work, we should see her as that, as someone, a particular girl on a particular morning in 1885, young and tired and far from home, and getting on with it, because that is what she was, and the great houses were full of her, and the comfort of the age was built on the labor of hundreds of thousands of her, each one a real child, each one someone's daughter, each one a whole person, at the very bottom of the great tall house, lighting the fire in the dark. She turns back to her work, this real girl, because the pots are waiting and the day is long, and we turn with her into the fuller day, and toward the thought of what her life, taken whole, actually was, which is where, gently, we will end. The day, once fully awake, did not let up. And though our night together has been chiefly about the hours before dawn, it is worth following the arc of the whole day to its end, so that you understand what waited beyond the morning we have lived, and how far the scullery maid's day stretched at both ends. Through the middle of the day, the kitchen worked without rest, because a great house ate more than once, and each meal was a labor. There was the family's luncheon to prepare, and the servants' midday dinner, the main meal of the servants' day, and all the cooking these required. And behind all the cooking, always, the washing up, the pots and pans coming to your sink in their endless tide, so that your day was a continuous cycle of cleaning what the cooking dirtied. Never finished, never caught up, the pile always renewing itself as fast as you reduced it. And between the meals, there was the ceaseless other work, the fetching and carrying, the trimming and preparing of vegetables for the meals to come, the scouring of the copper, the scrubbing of the floors, the keeping of the kitchen and scullery in the order the cook demanded, the 100 small tasks that filled every moment not given to washing. There was no idle time. The kitchen did not permit it. From the moment you came down in the dark to the moment you climbed up again at night, the work was continuous, one task flowing into the next without pause. The whole long day, a single unbroken labor. And the great performance toward which the whole day built was the family's dinner. In the evening, the most elaborate meal of the day, and the kitchen's supreme effort. As the dinner hour approached, the kitchen rose to a pitch of intense, concentrated work, the cook driving the preparation of the many courses of a formal dinner, the kitchen maid laboring at her side, and you beneath them both, in the thick of it, fetching and carrying, and above all washing, because the dinner cooking generated an enormous tide of dirty pans and dishes, and it all came to you, and you stood at your sink through the whole frantic evening, scouring, so that the cook had the clean vessels she needed, and the mountain of used ones did not overwhelm the kitchen. The dinner going up to the family, course after course, was the climax of the kitchen's day, and it was for the scullery maid the hardest push of all, the evening's great labor, standing at the sink amid the steam and the heat and the pressure, while the beautiful dinner went up to the bright rooms above. And when at last the dinner was over, when the family had dined and the courses had all gone up and come down again as wreckage, the kitchen's day still was not done, because all of it had to be cleared. The vast washing up of a great dinner, the pots and the dishes and the endless things, and this final labor fell, as always, heaviest on you. Long after the family had risen from their table and withdrawn to their comfortable evening, you stood at your sink, working through the last great pile of the day, the dinner things, your hands raw in the cooling water, your feet aching on the wet floor, the kitchen quieter now, but the work not finished, because it was never finished until the last pan was scoured and dried and hung back in its place, and the kitchen made ready for the morning. The family were at their ease. You were at your sink, and this, the late washing up after the family's dinner, was very often the last work of the scullery maid's long day, the final labor before, at last, she might climb to her bed. And so, late, very late, long after the family had gone up to their warm beds, you finished. The last pan was clean. The kitchen was set in order for the morning, when it would all begin again. And you took your candle and climbed the back stairs, up through the dark, quiet house, past the floors where the family slept, up to your cold, bare attic under the slates, and you undressed in the dark and the cold, and you fell into your narrow bed, your body used up, your hands ruined, your feet sore, exhausted all the way through, and you had, before you, only a few short hours of sleep, because in the dark of the early morning you would wake again to the same cold, and rise, and come down, and light the fire, and begin the whole thing over, exactly as you had this morning, and as you would tomorrow, and the day after, and every day, for as long as this was your life. Think of the shape of that day, now that we have followed it end to end. You woke before 5 in the cold dark. You worked with barely a pause through the whole of the day, the fire and the water and the washing and the fetching and the scouring and the endless labor, through breakfast and luncheon and the servants' dinner and the great evening dinner and the final clearing until late at night. 16 hours, 17, 18. A day of labor longer than almost anything we would now think bearable. And then a few hours of sleep. And then the same again. That was the scullery maid's day. And it was not one hard day among easy ones. It was every day, the ordinary shape of her life. Day upon day upon day, her youth spent in this cycle, rising in the dark, and sleeping in the dark, and laboring through all the hours between. And the family upstairs, whose comfort all this labor produced, lived their easy, leisured days, floating on top of it, never seeing it, never thinking of it, never knowing the shape of the day that made their own days possible. Let the kitchen go quiet now, the last pan hung up, the fire banked low for the night, the room dark again, and waiting for the morning. Let the girl climb to her cold bed, and find, at last, a few hours of sleep. And let us look back, gently, at the whole of what we have seen, before we too let the day go, and rest. We have spent the night in a Victorian kitchen, from the cold dark waking before dawn to the late night when the last pan was washed. And we have watched the lowest servant in the house light the fire that woke it, and carry the water, and scour the endless pots, and we have seen the whole day she lived, and the whole life that day was part of. Before we let it all go quiet, let us hold it in view once more, honestly, and try to see it whole. The skill was real, and the strength was real, and they deserve to be named. The scullery maid was not merely a drudge, though her work was drudgery. She had real competence, real knowledge, learned hard, the knowledge of how to light and tend the range, how to keep the copper, how to scour and clean and manage the endless work of the kitchen, how to serve the cook and learn from her, and rise in time if she could. She had real strength, physical and otherwise, the strength to do this punishing work day after day, and to bear it, and to keep going. And she had, many of them, real ambition and real hope, the will to climb the ladder above her, to become a kitchen maid and then a cook, to make something of herself in the one arena open to a poor girl. And some of them did, rose from the scullery to run kitchens of their own. And that was a real achievement, hard won, and theirs. The girl at the bottom of the house was capable and enduring, and often quietly determined, and to see her only as a victim would be to miss the strong and living person she actually was. And the injustice was real too, and naming her strength does not soften it. She worked longer and harder than almost anyone in the house, for less than anyone in the house, at the very bottom of it. And her labor was the foundation everything else rested on, and she was rewarded for it with the lowest wage, the coldest room, the hardest tasks, the least regard, invisibility even from the other servants, and a day that ran from before dawn to late at night, with barely a pause. She was often a child, doing grown and grinding work far from home. She risked her health and her body in it, and if it broke her, the house owed her nothing and would simply find another girl. The comfort of the family was built directly on her labor, and the family never saw her, never thanked her, never knew her name, because the whole house was arranged, deliberately, to keep her out of their sight and out of their minds. That was not an accident. It was the design. The ease above was built on the labor below, and built also on the labor below being hidden, so that the ease could be enjoyed without the discomfort of seeing its cost. Hold both of those together, because the kitchen was both, always, at once. It was a place of real skill and real human dignity and real hope, and it was a place of real exploitation and real hardship and real injustice. And these were not two different kitchens, but the same one, the same cold room and the same warm fire, and the same girl kneeling at the grate. Her competence was real, and her exploitation was real, and the cruelest part was how completely her skill and her strength were spent in the service of a comfort she would never share, poured into the foundations of a house whose upper floors she was not free to live in. She made the warmth and lived in the cold. She made the feast and ate her bread alone. She woke the house and was never woken to, and she did it. Most of them did it, without much complaint, because it was the life they had been given, and there was little use in complaining, and because there was, for some, the hope of rising, and because a poor girl in 1885 did what she had to do to live. This is not a judgment on any one family, or any one cook, or any one girl. It is an observation about the shape of a world that arranged its comfort in this way, that built its ease on hidden labor and its grace on aching hands, and that has very largely passed away, though not so long ago as we might like to think. When we admire a preserved Victorian kitchen now, the gleaming copper and the great black range, we should remember that the gleam was raised by somebody's raw hands in the cold before dawn, and that behind the beautiful room there was always a girl, real and young and tired, who made it so, and whose name we will never know, because the house was built so that we would never need to. She is the missing person in the picture, the one the design of the house erased, and the small act of remembering her, of putting her back into the kitchen in our minds, kneeling at the grate in the dark, is very nearly the only thing we can now do for her, more than a century too late. So let us do it. Let us keep her in the picture, the girl at the bottom of the great house, who lit the fire that woke the world. The fire is banked low now, glowing softly in the dark kitchen. The copper hangs dull and quiet on the walls. The last pan is washed and hung, the floor scrubbed, the room set in order for a morning only a few hours off. And somewhere above, under the slates, in a cold, narrow bed, the girl who made it all sleeps for a little while, before she must rise again in the dark and begin once more. Let her sleep. Let the kitchen rest. Let the whole vanished world of it, the fire and the copper and the cold stone and the laboring hands, settle now into the dark and grow still. And let yourself, too, rest now, and let go of the day you have carried, and drift down gently into the quiet and the dark, the way the tired sleep at the end of a long day, down past thought, past the cold kitchen and the sleeping house, and the last low glow of the fire, into sleep and rest, and the deep, still peace of it. Sleep now. The fire is lit, the work is done, and the morning is still a long way off.